Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today's topic is a neuroscientist looks at parapsychology. With me is Professor Marjorie Woollacott, who is an emeritus professor of neuroscience and human physiology at the University of Oregon. She is also the co-author of the textbook Motor Control, Translating Research into Clinical Practice. And her most recent book is called Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. Welcome, Marjorie.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. In a previous interview, we talked about your own spiritual awakening through meditation. And what we didn't talk about then, but which is where the story begins now, is that you began to endeavor to see if you could apply your talent as a neuroscientist to researching meditation.
Yes, and I'll take you back just one or few steps, and that was that point in my career when I realized that I was living almost a schizophrenic life. So one half of me was studying meditation and having these amazing experiences that went well beyond my materialist worldview, and the other side was locked into my materialist worldview in the laboratory. And I said, how can I put these together? So I began to do research in my laboratory first on meditation. And I thought, let me try looking at meditation from the scientific perspective to see if I can understand a little more about these subtle levels of awareness that I was experiencing in my own meditation. So one of the first studies that I did was actually with a graduate student from UC Berkeley, whose own professor wouldn't publish her research with her because he thought it was a little bit too out in left field. Yeah. And when I met him at a Society for Neuroscience meeting, he knew I meditated, and he asked me if I might be willing to help her publish the paper. And of course, I was ecstatic. And what she was looking at is the attentional systems of meditators versus non-meditators. And she was asking, do people who meditate have a better ability to actually focus and perhaps inhibit any sort of actions that might get in the way of their focus? And she used something called the Stroop Test, which you might have heard of, which is one where you have a lot of different colors on a particular page, and you are supposed to not say the actual printed word that the color is in, which, so the printed words would be yellow, green, blue, or white, for example, but you had to say the color itself of the print.
The letters were in different colors.
The letters were in different colors, and most people have a propensity to actually say whatever word they see faster than they would the color of the print that is in. And meditators were much, much better at doing that, at inhibiting that typical response of saying the word and not the color.
In other words, they were better at concentrating.
Exactly, much better at that focus that was needed. And also what I found very interesting is that this correlation showed basically that the longer you meditated, the more hours of meditation you had in your experience, the better you were at actually doing this. So that was my start. I thought, well, that's very interesting. So meditators clearly focus a lot better than non-meditators. And this particular function we might call executive attention function, where you're really homing your focus in. Then in my own laboratory, I had a graduate student that also wanted to look at meditation, but also Tai Chi, which is a moving form of meditation. And in fact, she was most interested in Tai Chi. And I said, look, we have to also do a meditation group in addition to a Tai Chi group. And why don't we compare them to aerobic walkers? Because aerobic walkers also are known to have better attentional system than, say, a couch potato, because they're bringing more blood to their brain. So we actually had 4 groups: Tai Chi, meditators, aerobic walkers, and then the sedentary control group that I call the couch potatoes. And what we found when we gave them a test, they had to do this test in the laboratory of looking at a computer screen. And what they had to do is, whenever a red light came on, randomly coming on the left or the right side of the screen, they had to press a mouse button according to ever-changing rules. So what would happen is that on 2 trials, when the red light came on, they had to press the mouse button on the same side of the screen. But in the next 2 trials, they had to switch their rule and hit the mouse button on the opposite side of the screen. So once again, their executive attention system was constantly monitoring where they were in the process and trying to react as fast as they can. But also we had EEG electrodes over their head, 256 electrodes.
Whoa.
And we were then able to monitor what we call the event-related potential that happens in your brain when that red light comes on, that tells us how much attention you're giving to that red light.
Ah.
So the bigger the event-related potential, the more attention you're giving to the red light. And what we found was that the meditators and those people that practice Tai Chi long-term were the ones that had the largest event-related potentials when the red light came on, and they were also the fastest at doing this particular response.
As opposed to aerobic walkers.
Exactly. And the aerobic walkers, interestingly, were halfway in between the sedentary adults and the people who practiced meditation and Tai Chi. So yes, there's a little bit of improvement with aerobic walking. It's good to do that.
Yeah.
But if you add in meditation or Tai Chi, then you get a much bigger attentional effect. But then we did one more thing, and that is that with 256 electrodes, you can actually find the place in the brain, in the cortex, where these event-related potentials are actually coming from. And what we found is that these potentials were actually larger in what is called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is like right about here on your brain, and it's part of your executive attention system, along with your frontal cortex, which is also part of your executive system. So that really tells us that, first of all, yes, you are able to attend much, much better when you practice meditation or Tai Chi, and it's due to a specific change in a part of your brain related to the executive attentional system called the anterior cingulate cortex.
And so the meditators were about equal to the Tai Chi practitioners.
Right. And I should say something about this. We looked in Eugene, Oregon, where we were doing this study at the University of Oregon. We could not find any meditators who were sedentary, who were couch potatoes. Every meditator actually was out there walking, doing some aerobic activity. So really, my meditators are probably very much like the Tai Chi people in that they were doing exercise as well as this mental focus.
Okay.
Yeah. But what I want to say next is that that was interesting. I really enjoyed doing that study, and I felt it wasn't really answering my deepest question as a meditator. My deepest question was, where is consciousness really originating in the brain, and is consciousness fundamental? Is consciousness primary? That was my experience that I had in meditation, that there was an energy that I wasn't measuring in the laboratory that I was experiencing in meditation.
Now, if I had been in your laboratory, the first thing I would have done was try to hook myself up while I was meditating. Did you ever do that?
Oh, and of course. And so I should mention, first of all, that in that very study, I was one of those people in the meditator group. And I was one of those people that was doing aerobic activity along with my meditation. So yes, I did. And in fact, if we were showing this in a conference, I would be showing you me with 256 electrodes on my head. And so yes, I was one of those people that did show that increase in my own attentional focus.
Did you ever try to meditate while you were hooked up?
I did. And in fact, in another study that another graduate student did, we simply looked at the various frequencies really that you would find in meditation. And typically I and the other people in that study showed what other people have shown before too, which is we have much more theta frequency activity when we're meditating than when we are wide awake and interacting with other people, where we would find more beta activity or something like that.
So the puzzle, I suppose, that was you were pursuing is, what does all this mean?
What does it all mean? Exactly. And so I was realizing that this work with electrophysiology was interesting, but it wasn't giving me the answers that I was really looking for. Now, I should say there was one study recently published by some people in Germany that gives me a little bit more of an answer. And that is one where in doing their EEG study and looking at the electroencephalogram of the brain, they actually asked people to do different types of meditation. And they asked them, for example, to do a simple, what we might call an open awareness meditation, where you're simply sitting there and you're aware of everything in the room, but you're trying not to think about things. You're not judging them. Another one was simply closing your eyes and letting your mind wander. But the third one was to try to have total stillness of meditation. So in other words, you were really trying to have a quiet mind where you felt the sense of, perhaps we might call, non-local awareness with absolute stillness. What they found is, compared to eyes open, which was their control group, it was the group that was practicing this total stillness of mind that had the quietest EEGs. And they said for them, the key was actually the size of the EEGs. And actually, it was going down toward the level of EEG you might expect to see in a near-death experience when your cortex is no longer functioning at its normal levels.
I see.
So to me, that was interesting because here is a connection now between meditation and my next topic that I began to actually do research on, which was near-death experiences.
I see. Well, you mentioned the phrase non-local awareness. What do you mean by that?
That's a good question. When I use the term non-local awareness, I mean a sense that I am feeling unity consciousness with everything around me. So there's a stillness of mind, no thoughts going on, and a sense of expansive openness.
Oh, okay. So then you began exploring the research on near-death experience.
And to me, that was the most amazing thing as a materialist neuroscientist that I started out as, trying to understand a topic that is beyond materialism. So I'll take a step back. So one of the things that I began to do as a neuroscientist is I said, okay, I need to study these particular topics like near-death experiences from a scientific point of view. So I am going to go to the literature and look at all of the peer-reviewed, carefully designed studies on near-death experiences. And I should say to the other skeptics that might be out there, all you have to do is go to something called PubMed on the web, which is our government's list of all of the research in, for example, neuroscience and medical sciences, and type in the words near-death experience, and up come all of the studies that have been done. I did this, and I found amazing studies.
Now, we should be clear about one thing, and that is that, to my knowledge, nobody has attempted to induce a near-death experience in the laboratory.
This is right.
Yeah.
This is so a good point. So in the best possible situation, what you would do in an experiment is you would have a control group and you would have an experimental group, and they would both be like happening within the same 2 weeks of each other. And your experimental group would literally have something like a near-death experience. We can't do that because these happen spontaneously.
Yes.
So the best studies which have been done do something where they actually bring in everyone that has a cardiac arrest in a network of hospitals over a period of like maybe 3 years into the study. And then of all of those people that come in with cardiac arrest, they measure their EEGs during the cardiac arrest. They know how long it happened. They measure their blood chemistry, their oxygen levels in the blood. And then what they can do afterwards is, for those who survive, and not many survive, but for those that survive, they then interview them and they say, what happened during that particular time where you had cardiac arrest, a flatlined EEG? Did you have any experiences? And Pim van Lommel and his colleagues from the Netherlands were one of the groups that did one of these studies. And these are the gold standard of studies in this type of research because they're called prospective studies. You start at a particular point in time and you collect very systematically all the data from everybody that comes into the hospitals. And what he found was that something like 12% of the people had a near-death experience when their EEG was absolutely flatlined. That means their cortex had no activity at all. And your cortex is where all your sensory experiences are being registered in your brain. So when these people then, during cardiac arrest, were able to tell the people in the operating room, for example, that they were hovering above their body and watching everything in the room, and they could identify particular people by what they were wearing, what they were saying. They could say everything that happened. There was no way for these doctors that were doing the study to say that this could happen from a materialist point of view. So when I saw that, and I saw these carefully analyzed data, I said, wait a minute. Why was I so skeptical before when actually there were research data already out here? So the first thing I discovered is be curious, look to see what other people have done.
So basically you're saying that because there was a flat line in terms of cortical activity,
Right.
It should not have been possible for these patients to register any sensory impressions at all.
At all. And besides, typically in many of these cases, they would have their eyelids taped shut, and they sometimes would have something, for example, in their ears. And so here you have a person that shouldn't be able, even if they came out of anesthesia, if they were in an operation when their heart had stopped, or if they simply had cardiac arrest, they shouldn't be able to perceive anything. And they're usually in a deep comatose state. And even if they could, how is it that they could see something from the perspective above their body and see all the people and the actions going on around them? There's no way from my materialist perspective I could explain that. So then you have to say, could consciousness actually exist without the activity of those neurons in my brain?
Yeah.
Now, I should say that there, of course, are skeptics, and I would have been a skeptic in the past, too. And what the skeptics might say is, well, perhaps what's happening is that that's simply a hallucination, and it's happening because the brain neurons are dying and they're letting out maybe too much neurotransmitter, and some neurotransmitters might be natural opiates. And so that's why they're feeling the bliss of the near-death experience, and maybe they're seeing in these hallucinations different things coming up inside of them, but purely hallucinatory. And what the doctors say is this. First of all, they say that it's not that your brain cells are still active. They say your cortex is flat. I mean, they say that after like about 20 seconds, there is no activity in your cortex at all. And if the cortex is where I register my visual experiences, how is it possible that anything, including a hallucination, would happen?
Well, is it possible, in your opinion, for consciousness to function in areas of the brain beneath the cortex?
And that's a wonderful question, which my fellow neuroscience colleagues, who even are meditators, would ask me because they're also skeptical.
Yeah.
And here is an interesting point. There is the ability in our midbrain now. We have visual neurons in our midbrain, but they don't allow us to perceive. What the visual neurons in our midbrain let us do is if there's something out there in the environment, an object, they will allow us to actually reach our hand toward the object more or less accurately, not very accurately. And people have recorded that, yes, you can do this, but you can't perceive anything. You are blind according to your own perception. In fact, the doctor will say to you, please reach for this object. And the person says, look, I can't see a thing. And they say, just go ahead and try, guess. And then the person comes sort of toward the object. So, but that's not what these people experience. The people have a very vivid experience of what's going on in the operating room.
So this piqued your interest because it's basically, I guess, what you'd have to call a scientific anomaly.
Exactly. Yes. And so then it's like, okay, near-death experiences are interesting. Well, how many people have actually done these studies? And an amazing number of people have, if you look on PubMed. Yeah. So there was my first indication. And then I said, okay, what about other paranormal phenomena? This is one that says consciousness looks like it is fundamental, it's primary. Why don't I look a little bit further? And I should say that I also began to talk to people that had had near-death experiences. And I found a fellow meditator at one particular meditation retreat, and I was telling her that I was writing my chapter right now on near-death experiences. And I said, I find this fascinating. And she said, oh, I am an MD. I was an atheist before I actually had my heart stop during a cesarean section during the birth of my third child. And she said, I now can tell you exactly what happened to me. And it was all verified by the hospital personnel that were in the room with me. And so her name is Bettina Payton. And in fact, she will be speaking at the International Association for Near-Death Studies meeting coming up this summer with me, and she will be telling about her transformation in terms of going from materialist neuroscientist to being again in the operating room under anesthesia, eyes taped shut, and suddenly becoming wide awake in the middle of the cesarean section when she hears her anesthesiologist say her blood pressure is too low. And she says that she could hear his alarmed voice and saying to the surgeon, how far along are you in the delivery? And then suddenly she hears a loud expletive. And then he says her heart has stopped. There's no blood pressure whatsoever. And at that moment, she says she realizes that her vision has opened into the room, even though her eyes are taped shut. So by some other mechanism, she sees the IV poles hanging from above her. She sees everything that's going on around her. And she notices at that point, nobody else knows her heart has stopped yet. And then suddenly she hears the cardiac monitor making these loud beeps to let everybody know. And then sees her anesthesiologist slam his fist into this large red button on the wall, basically calling the code to have people come in to work to resuscitate her. And she says at that point, she actually leaves that arena in her awareness. And she says, it's sort of beautiful how she describes it. She says, it's like she's going to this backmost boundary of her mind where there is this beautiful black subtle awareness. And she leans backward over this chasm of darkness below, arching backward in this graceful backward arc into the unknown. And she says the darkness sparkles, it shimmers. And she says she feels, again, more at home than she's ever felt before. And she hears this voice in that darkness. And suddenly this voice is saying to her, you must live. And at that point, she doesn't want to go back because she's in ecstasy, in this total sense of like being in oneness with the universe. But then this voice comes again and again, and she feels herself spiraling back downward into the operating room, sees at that point the resuscitation team burst through these double doors into the room, and she's watching now from above. And she sees her own surgeon doing what he later calls his first 3-minute hysterectomy. Oh. Because the baby now has been delivered, but he has to get her heart going again. And first of all, he has to do the hysterectomy. And then she sees this elderly surgeon in scrubs walk into the room very slowly and go through all the people winding his way to her side. And then she says he reaches his hand into her blood-filled abdomen, finds the aorta, clamps it shut, and she says at that point it's a very painful moment where she feels everything he's doing, but she knows this is the moment, the turning point in the operation, and she's going to live. And moments later, a nurse whispers in her ear that her little baby girl has survived. And she said the next moment she's waking up in the recovery room, surrounded by her husband, who is a doctor, and all the other personnel. And before they can say a word, she puts up her hand and asks for something to write with. And they give her a napkin. And then she writes on the napkin these words. She says, I know my heart stopped. I know my uterus is out. And I know I have a little baby girl. So she could tell them that she really was alert during the entire experience. And she says afterwards, all of the hospital personnel said that everything she witnessed during that time is actually absolutely accurate. And they were willing to go on a major news program in Boston where this was happening to actually say that that was the case. So in hearing that firsthand from somebody, it was even stronger than hearing Pim Van Lommel's and other people's articles, because I was hearing her own transformation from a materialist, atheist, MD, to somebody who now said, wait a minute. This was real, and now I believe consciousness is primary. I had that experience.
So what you're saying is experiences like this are not possible to explain from a materialistic perspective.
Absolutely. I don't know how anybody could say that. And in fact, when I do have materialist friends and I tell them a story like that, what they need to say to keep their own point of view is that she must have been hallucinating. The doctors must have been wrong. There must have been, perhaps she was experiencing something that happened when she wasn't under anesthesia. Perhaps she was guessing, because it can't fit in with a materialist perspective. And they simply can't seem to accept that this actually happened.
So where did you progress after you had these extraordinary encounters with the near-death experience?
Well, so I went on to look at other research on whether consciousness is primary. And one of them that struck me as a very interesting area of research started out with things that are actually on the border between medical science and what we might call parapsychology. And that was work, for example, with hypnosis. And well, I even want to take a step backward, because the placebo effect is something we all know about in Western medicine. And it is a total paradox in Western medicine, because what we're saying about the placebo effect is that you give a patient an inert substance like sugar, a sugar pill, and you tell them that this might be a pain reliever. And something like 30% of those patients will actually have that inert substance lower their pain. But in addition to that, they actually activate pain-reducing pathways in your brain, just as if you had the pain reliever itself. So your mind, thinking it's getting a pain reliever, actually activates the neural pathways and releases the opioids that would actually cause a reduction in pain. And I am a researcher in rehabilitation and motor control, and I deal a lot with Parkinson's patients. Now, Parkinson's patients are often given something called dopamine, which actually brings in the dopamine in their brain to higher levels so they function more normally. And they showed that even with Parkinson's patients, a placebo effect of this drug called L-Dopa that they are given will actually increase the dopamine release in their brain. And I'm thinking, how can that be where your mind is affecting your physiology, where neuroscientists say, no, 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 it's your physiology, it's the pharmaceutical that affects your brain? We're seeing exactly the opposite. So that was my first interesting foray into this on the borderlines. Then I looked at hypnosis. And here, once again, I was amazingly startled because there is research in many areas, but I'll give you just one that I find interesting, and that is dealing with a particular genetic disorder called ichthyosis. And what ichthyosis is this genetic disease that causes a scaling of your skin so that it actually looks, ichthyosis means fish, it actually looks like fish scales.
Ichthyology would be the study of fish.
Exactly. And so what you see is this hardened surface of your skin that ends up bleeding and oozing because it is not normal skin at all. And again, your genetics have caused this. And there was one study that was done in Britain by a doctor named Mason, who looked at one particular young boy who was 16 years of age. Now, he had ichthyosis, and he had gone to many doctors to try to have it fixed. And they had done skin grafts. And they would take areas from his abdomen that didn't have any of the scaling, they would put it on his arm, and immediately that arm would turn back into this fish scaling type of symptoms. So it didn't work. And so
difficult condition to treat.
Definitely difficult. So finally, at the last real moment, they said, well, why don't we go ahead and try hypnosis? So he was taken to a doctor, and what the doctor did, which I thought was actually brilliant, is he said, we're just going to focus on your right arm first. And he said, under hypnosis, I want that right arm basically to be totally normal, to have all of the scaling disappear. Within 10 days, that arm looked almost normal. There was almost no ichthyosis left. And then the doctor went back and did the same thing with the other arm and then the legs, etc. And what he showed is the ichthyosis didn't go entirely away, but something like 90% of the arm was now absolutely normal. And he said he followed that child for a number of years, and actually it continued to get better. It never got worse again. So here we're saying that hypnosis, which is the mind affecting the physiology of the body, was able to affect a genetic disease and change that genetic disease, what appeared to be permanently long-term.
I understand that the skin and various skin conditions like warts are particularly susceptible to hypnosis.
Yes, and you make the other interesting point with warts, where they've also done this sort of thing, where they can actually even say, like with this man with ichthyosis, I want you to actually get rid of the wart right here on this particular part of the body and leave the others there. They say this again under hypnotic suggestion, and the person literally can get rid of this virally caused wart in that one area and not affect the others. And to me, the reason this is so interesting is it says it's not just a general improvement in your immune function, because you are literally, with your suggestion, going to one particular part of the body and affecting it in that area, not just your entire body itself.
And once again, this would be an anomalous finding that not explicable in terms of the neuroscience that you've spent your life studying.
Exactly. So again, an amazing eye-opening experience for me. So then I went on and I began to look a little bit at some of the other work related to mind actually affecting matter. And this is what I might call truly what we might call psi phenomena and the true parapsychology. And I think, for example, of some of Dean Radin's work with John at Princeton, at the Paralaboratories there.
Yes.
And I think what was interesting there is they first started out with simply asking their subjects to see if they could influence the output of random number generators and see if they could make the random number generator outputs go a little bit higher than normal or a little bit lower than normal in terms of the numbers. And they found, in fact, that yes, they could, that there was a significant difference in the output just by your focusing like high. I want higher numbers, higher numbers. And I think what was interesting is when they later did that same experiment, now using what we call the double slit experiment. Just a reminder that that is trying to get photons to move more through one slit than another slit of this double slit apparatus.
Based on the classical study in physics, as I recall, from the late 19th century.
Exactly. And what they found there was that, yes, you could, with your own mind, simply focusing on, I want more photons to go through one slit than the other, you could do this. And most interesting to me was people who meditated were significantly better than people who didn't meditate at doing this. Now, they also note that this is not a giant phenomenon, but it is statistically significant even though it's small. And they said that when they did experiment after experiment after experiment in their laboratory and other people in laboratories around the world, they found that this was absolutely, statistical at a phenomenal level. So once again, I'm saying, my goodness, these persons' minds can affect a piece of equipment that is in front of them. They can affect photons going through slits in front of them. And the better you are able to focus, as we also were talking about in our own laboratory with meditation, the better you are able to do this. So,
and you're also saying that this has been replicated.
Yes.
We're not talking about just some kook scientist who, for all we know, has got either a unique talent or, in the worst case, faking their data.
Yes. I mean, so first of all, these are people at prestigious universities, whether it's Princeton University, people, for example, at Berkeley. I'm in my own laboratory at the University of Oregon. People have done this sort of work at so many different places. And I'm thinking, how can we claim this is anecdotal, which is what the people that are skeptics want to say? This is not anecdotal. This is done around the world at university after university. And yet, we have a hard time getting those things published in normal scientific journals because of the skepticism of journal editors and their concerns that their materialist colleagues would think their journal was perhaps less credible because we were actually putting in research related to paranormal phenomena.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Well, your explorations didn't stop there either, did they?
No, they didn't. And I will go on maybe to one or two others depending on our time.
Yeah.
One of them I found interesting was related to actually energy healing like Reiki. So once again, I'm at a university that trains medical students. And my medical students, from their normal courses they take in our university, never really focus on alternative and complementary medicine. But I became intrigued by complementary medicine myself, and I began to study Reiki. And I want to first of all say that I actually have taken a course in Reiki because I would teach a course in complementary medicine for the seniors at my university. And I said, I can't teach a course in these things just from an abstract level. I have to actually explore it myself. So I went to a Reiki master and I actually experienced Reiki being done on me. And I noticed that my mind became much, much quieter during the Reiki session. And that sense of stillness and relaxation and well-being lasted the rest of my day. I became even more intrigued.
Of course, you were already a meditator.
I was already a meditator, exactly. And so it was perhaps even easier for me than perhaps a skeptic. Then I decided to go and take a Reiki workshop because I wanted to know more about what would happen. And this was a 3-day Reiki workshop. Now, I came to that workshop really as a scientist who wanted to observe what was happening. And on the first day of the workshop, this woman, master of Reiki, actually initiates us into Reiki itself. And when I say initiates us, she was literally having us go into a meditative state and then literally putting her hands into the palms of our hands. And as she said, feeling that she was transferring or initiating us into this ability to actually practice Reiki.
So as I understand Reiki, what you're doing is acting as a conduit for a healing energy that comes from a higher source.
Exactly. And you're trying to let that flow through you then into the body of another person. And so that was very interesting for me to hear that about Reiki. And then what was interesting for me is the next day she said, okay, now you have to practice. Now, I hadn't thought that I was actually going to be practicing this. But what I realized is that we were going to be pairing up with another person, and it happened to be a man that was a Reiki practitioner already. He'd taken a few workshops. So I said, you go first, because I don't really know what I'm doing yet. When I sat down on the table and then lay down, and he began putting his hands over various parts of my body, I began to think, I know this. This feels familiar to me. I can do this. And when I got up from his session on me, I then went ahead and did it on him, and it felt like a perfectly natural phenomenon as I was placing my hands on his heart, on his abdomen, on the crown of his head. And afterwards, when I got up, our teacher of the workshop was standing next to me, and she said, Marjorie, she said, you do that in such a beautifully organized manner. Now, I was laughing at her. I thought she meant, oh, you're a scientist, you're very organized. But she said, no, you're really good at it. And I contemplated that because I thought, how can this be? And then I thought, it's perhaps my 40 years of meditation putting me into this very quiet state of mind where then I can allow this energy to actually flow through me and literally feel the energy through my hands going into the persons that I'm working with.
And I presume as a meditator, you would probably say that this Reiki energy is similar to but different than the Shakti and the Shakti pot you experience as a meditator.
Exactly. I think that was another interesting awakening for me in a certain sense, is that I thought, wow, what is really happening with a Reiki practitioner? And doesn't this seem a lot like, as you're saying, the transference of energy from a meditation master into someone else to awaken that energy in them? And I think that one is at this perhaps very high spiritual perspective, but the other is taking it into a practical area of energy healing and helping another person through, again, this universal energy flowing through you.
And while we're discussing such comparisons, I'm guessing as well that the out-of-body experiences that or the near-death experiences we discussed earlier, bore a strong resemblance to some of your own non-local experiences that you experienced as a meditator.
Right. And you're reminding me that that was one of the most fascinating things for me when I first read about near-death experiences, is that I was thinking, wow, when people have that experience and they experience, for example, this light, this all-encompassing light, or this incredible joy, it reminded me exactly of my own and other people's meditation experiences.
Yeah.
And then I thought, wow, it's interesting, too, that many people who have a near-death experience want to replicate it. And the way that some of these people replicate it is by going into meditation. And then they find that when they begin to practice meditation, they go back to that same state of awareness they had in their NDE.
Well, before we conclude this interview, I don't mind going on for a long time because it's so fascinating. Let's talk about your exploration of reincarnation research.
Yes. So this is, first of all, the hardest area for me as a neuroscientist to actually even go into, even to look at the data on, because we as neuroscientists do not believe that you could literally come back in another lifetime and have a new body in terms of being a previous personality. So I went into this research with a lot of skepticism, and what happened to me is that I began reading the research of Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia, who I should mention was, because he is now dead, but was a psychiatrist. He was trained in biochemistry as well. He was the head of his department for a number of years, and he began doing this research because he was interested in child personality development, and he felt these cases of children that said when they were 2 or 3 years old that they were not who their parents thought they were from another family, from another city or another country, seemed to be very interesting to him as a special area of personality development, you might call it. And then, of course, he went to different countries around the world to investigate these cases of reincarnation, or what he would say suggestive of reincarnation. Because he always maintained this attitude of detachment, saying, is it true or is it not? Let's investigate it. And what I loved about Ian Stevenson is that, like a good scientist, which he was, he chose the best investigative methods he could. Now, again, you can't do a randomized controlled clinical trial with reincarnation, but you can use the best legal evidence that a lawyer would use if he were investigating, for example, a crime. And what you do is you only look at firsthand witnesses, you record everything very, very carefully. And what he did with these children who would have these experiences of memories when they were 2 or 3 years of age, he would say, this is the prime age to look at these children because they haven't had influences from outside their own immediate family. So how would they know about a person living in another city or another state, something like that? And then he very carefully interviewed the child and their family when the child says, hey, I'm from a village 15 miles away, and this was my name, and these were the landmarks in the village. He interviews them, and then he goes to look at that village and see if the child was correct in the landmarks. Then he goes to see if he can find the original family, and very often he finds the original family.
It's detective work,
It's detective work, exactly. And so, and then he gets all of the statements of the family, all of the statements of the child and his or her family, and then he compares them to see how many are accurate.
Point by point.
Point by point. So again, the scientist in me was actually ecstatic. It's like, oh, this is real science, the best you can do for cases suggestive of reincarnation. Now, the hardest part for me, however, was this. Ian Stevenson has said, and others have said with him, in about 35% of these cases, the child has a birthmark in this life that is similar to the mode of death in the previous life. Now, I took many courses in genetics as an undergraduate and a graduate student, and I know from the materialist perspective that you only get body physiology and birthmarks from the genes of your parents. So this seems to be impossible according to my materialist perspective. And yet he's saying 35% of the cases. So it was wonderful to look at how he investigated that. And in one case, for example, There was a story of a young boy that said that he had been actually a owner of a radio shop in another town. In this case, it was India. And he had died when he was in his 30s because he had been a smuggler on the black market. And he had been involved with other groups on the black market that were gangs that were vying with him for the black market. And he said that what happened is that when he was about 30 years of age, one of these gangs, as he was driving home from work in his car, were waiting for him, and they shot him. And he knew exactly where they shot him in the head. And when the people looked at this young boy now telling the story about this, they happened to notice that there was a scar at exactly the point on the temple where the bullet would have gone into his head. And what this collaborator with Ian Stevenson did, Antonia Mills, is that she went back to the hospital where they had the autopsy reports of the death of this previous person. And she saw, in fact, all of the details that were exactly the place of the scar on this child today. So there's something that I don't know how to explain in terms of my materialist reality, but there it is. So I'm simply curious and I want to know
It's
more.
remarkable enough that a young child would, even if it were a fantasy, have such a strange fantasy.
Exactly. And in this particular case, the little child who was nicknamed Titu actually was taken to the radio shop of the person that he said he was in the previous lifetime. And he actually identified the manager by name. He said where the money drawer was, where he'd always kept his money, where there was no way of knowing it. And he also said, oh, this particular part of the radio shop has been changed since I was here last. And sure enough, it had been changed. So he remembered everything. And he also felt that his previous parents of the previous personality, who was named Suresh, were actually his real parents. And he kept saying, you, his current parents, are not my parents. These are my parents. He never identified with those current parents.
Well, it would seem to me that the appearance of birthmarks like that correspond to the death wounds of a previous personality is rather reminiscent of the work you reported on earlier in hypnosis with the raising and the disappearance of warts and the ichthyosis, that conditions on the skin are amenable to our thoughts.
And you raise a really interesting point that until this moment I hadn't really thought about. Thank you, Jeffrey. And that is literally that it's our mind affecting our body, our material reality. And what you're reminding me of is that the mind of this person, which had a very traumatic death, because first of all, I should say that the children that come back typically have had a traumatic death when they were young. And it's almost like they need to complete a story, if you might want to say, of this life unfolding, and they come back again. And that trauma to them at that moment seems to be carried then with them into the new body. As you say, the mind affecting the matter, the physiology of the current body.
Well, all of these experiences certainly suggest that from the point of view of human physiology, which is your professional career has been in, that we need to develop vastly expanded ideas of how our bodies work.
Exactly. And to me, if we're a curious neuroscientist, we would actually be excited about trying to do this, about taking all of the data and saying, can we actually now create a new model of consciousness and mind-body interactions that can take all of this into account? And I'm hoping that fellow neuroscientists who are intrigued by these things, who might have had some of these experiences, might be willing to take the step that might be a little risky in our current academic environment, our academic milieu, to begin to look at this type of research and perhaps begin to test to see if maybe all of these things really can be replicated again and again and again, so that we can convince our fellow scientific colleagues this is a reality.
Well, I know that you have some important theoretical ideas about how this might work, and we plan to do a future interview about that. So thank you so much for being with me once again, Marjorie.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us, and check our listings for additional interviews with Professor Marjorie Woollacott.